Hey everyone, welcome to Neighbor Science, the only podcast about political economy and anime. We are here to decide if the future of civilization will be Blom or Dr. Stone. And today we are talking about the factory system, everybody's favorite way to do work.
Yeah, distributed slavery in a building.
So, in order to talk about the factory system, we need something to contrast it with. What came before the factory system? So the answer to that, of course, is the putting out system, which I think is a very funny and vaguely sexual name.
I mean, I was gonna say if I'd had a putting out system in my 20s, I wouldn't have gone to grad school. I'd be fine.
Yeah, it's called Tinder, I think.
Well, that is for most people far from systematic, but
then I guess it's called sex work.
sex work is a system.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a bit like a factory.
Putting out work is work, okay?
Yes, it is. That is true. Yes. Yeah.
So a lot of people might know this more as like the workshop system or like the cottage crafts system or something like that. So it's basically the system that was used in the ancient and medieval era, which continues today even in some places. And basically, it's where a central contractor hires small shops to produce a run of goods, as opposed to it being done in a central place of manufacturing, like a factory.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So instead of having one centralized building where a bunch of people do small operations to produce like semi-finished products, and then eventually come out with a fully fledged product. The putting out system was there was some semi-finished products, but mostly it was you would get materials and then make a finished product, and it would just happen in a bunch of little cottages or workshops instead of one big factory.
Right.
And
right.
Yeah,
So well, I was going to say, not to get too far ahead of ourselves here, but that seems like the sort of thing that we can try to go back to now as things like print on demand, in particular like 3D printing on demand in small shops, and the push again back to like local production and local buying and selling and all this kind of stuff. Like I feel like we could potentially swerve back to something like that, just in a more efficient and like less labor intensive kind of way now that we have all this tech.
Yeah.
So we could actually potentially return to that as like a norm, and like save ourselves a lot of time, energy, and grief if we can just kind of break free of, all this. If we could, I think, again, not trying to get ahead of ourselves with the theme here and the topic here, but if we could get back to something like the putting out system where we are autonomous doing it, as opposed to letting the whole like gig economy bullshit ruin our fucking lives by taking advantage of this ahead of us, like by co-opting it before and preempting it before it's even prevalent. I think that's something that we could work toward. I mean, anyway.
Well, one of the great things about the putting out system was that it tended to be done as piecework instead of wage work, which piecework is like so fucking rare now.
Yeah,
I can't think of an industry that really uses it anymore.
Not as an industry, no. Yeah. Except for luxury goods.
Yeah, probably true. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Like fruit picking or like produce harvesting used to be piecework. Like you would get paid by the bushel,
right?
Of
that's
getting
right.
paid by the hour. So if you could work faster, then you could make more money. Or as opposed to wage work, you could say pick 5 bushels of produce and then be done for the day, versus having to stay there all day and doesn't matter like how fast or slow you go, you're there all day.
Right.
So when modern people think of the putting out or workshop system, we think of kind of an ahistorical myth, especially like post-industrial revolution or post well, I don't know if the author meant Industrial Revolution or American Revolution, actually, because when I read it, I thought they meant American Revolution, but I guess it could be either one. But anyway, so like the way we think of it is usually like something we see in like A Knight's Tale or like fucking I don't know Lord of the Rings or WoW or whatever,
Yeah.
where an adolescent becomes an apprentice to a craftsman who's like
Yep.
like a fatherly or avuncular figure to them, and then eventually becomes a journeyman, and then once they like perfect their craft, they become like a master.
Right.
Um,
And then they become a
and
lover.
as
And then,
as my girlfriend put it, I asked her like how she thought this worked because I was just trying to get her to like say like what the common knowledge idea of the system is, and she's like,
right. Yeah.
I mean, you're the apprentice, and then you're the tradesman, and then you just die, I guess.
Yeah. That's kind of seems like it's
Yeah.
about right. Yeah. 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 I could say like this is still true of specific trades. Like my grandfather, who was a plumber,
Okay.
went through this sort of arc in his profession,
Which was
and which was he became an apprentice, um, and then he became a journeyman and then a master. You know, because that's the conventional way that you learn. Yeah. So his whole family. So this is kind of like a little snapshot of like one way that these industries have worked and can still work in this sort of very traditional sense, or in the traditional sort of format, is that like they had a family business. I think it went back like two generations before him, where somebody learned to be a plumber, and then they started like a plumbing sort of shop like this, and then they raised whichever of their kids wanted to be involved in the family business, to they trained them from kids, so they start as an apprentice when they're like, I think 12 or 13 or so. And they just start kind of helping around and shit like that and getting like a general sense of how things are run by the big people, their dad, their uncle, whatever. And then, yeah, and then eventually they become skilled at a basic level enough to trust them with more duties and stuff like that, and to kind of directly help out like the master plumbers and stuff. And then they become a journeyman, and then as a journeyman, they're actually able to fulfill a lot of this work, up till the point where they're kind of considered to have mastered all of these skills, and then that's why they become the master in the sense that they're a master of the skills. And so this is kind of one of those ambiguities in the term master, where you can be the master of the shop, as in the like owner, runner, whatever, business runner, the executive, right. But the point of calling them the master in the trades is to indicate that they have, general mastery of those skills that are necessary to basically respond to any need within that sort of cone. So this is just to clarify for listeners, kind of like the titles, how it seems to have worked traditionally, and it was a way to kind of keep the work, keep the structure of the work sort of flowing and steady, without risking too much on inexperienced workers. And in this kind of family shop model, of course, like the apprentice and the journeyman are making less, partly because this idea of risk, I guess, and also partly because they're being taken care of by the shop and the family, and so there's basically this kind of socially reproductive work that's being contributed to their well-being that isn't just money, so it's a bit like benefits. They're still kind of getting the benefits of being part of that shop. They have steady work. As long as they're not fucking up, they get to stay there, and it's pretty much a job for life as long as they continue to do good work. It might take you, as I understood it, it might take you a long time, a very long time, to make it from apprentice to journeyman, from journeyman to master. They don't rush you through it because they want to make sure that you get it first.
right.
But that longevity, that emphasis on longevity is two-sided. That they're helping you to secure your mastery of it, but at the same time they're also helping you to keep a job, and have income and so forth and so on. So that's in the kind of ideal model, traditional model, and that's definitely what I understand to be the case for, my grandfather and his family and how they operated it.
Okay.
Right. So it's like, and I'm not trying to just rationalize because he was a small business owner when he became the master plumber and all this shit. It's the family business, all this stuff. I'm not trying to just rationalize. Like there was probably a pretty significant income disparity between like him as the master plumber and owner and like his fucking employees who were like journeymen and stuff. And to me that's not really ideal, but that's kind of like that was the traditional way of doing things.
The way she goes.
Yeah. But this is kind of just me trying to explain. This is kind of how it could be in its best form.
Yeah, so that actually like kind of touches on what I was going to get to.
Okay, yeah.
Which is like the reality of the apprentice journeyman master relationship. At some points in history was a lot more like modern employment where the interests of journeymen and masters were opposed because the master would either own the shop or just generally have higher income or expect too much out of the journeyman workers. And a lot of journeymen would not just never become masters. Like it wasn't a sure thing that you'd become a master.
So it was an exploitative relationship. Yeah.
Yeah.
In these cases,
in the post-revolutionary period, again, I don't know if this is post-American Revolution or post-Industrial Revolution, the turnover rate for journeymen became very high. So one example cited in this article that I read was a shop that you needed usually no more than 5 workers at a time. Had 49 different journeyman workers over an 8-year period.
Man, holy shit! That's 6 or 7 new ones every fucking year. Yeah. Jesus.
Yeah. Supposedly there was a lot of upward mobility during that period. So part of that could have been journeymen trying to switch jobs to get higher wages, like a lot of millennials do now.
Yeah. Right, the lateral move. Yeah.
Yeah. And what was I going to say? Oh, and also there was this whole thing of like the Elizabethan poor laws made it so that parish officials could take vagrants or children whose parents they deemed unfit to take care of them and put them into apprenticeships. And this kind of grew into workshops getting like giant groups of child laborers that had like no training. And so that would like basically, we'll get into this more later, but it kind of was the start of the like grisly child labor that we see during the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, as soon as you mentioned these parish children that got literally rounded up in batches, which sounds eerily familiar. I was gonna say, like, I can think of at least one class of people in capitalism who'd be interested in getting, a giant mass of unskilled child workers in one place.
Peter Thiel.
Yeah, exactly.
For as blood bags.
Yeah, pretty much. Like, they just cycle them through. You got 80% of the kids on the line, 18 hours a day, and then the other 20% of the kids are
the healthiest ones.
Right, the healthiest ones, are marching single file to your fucking office to get their blood drawn, so you can, for reasons.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, they sign a consent form, so it's okay.
Right. As everyone knows, if you put it on a contract, no matter what the contract says, that's fine. Then it makes it everything's fine. Yeah.
Especially if you're a child, I'm pretty sure.
Especially as a child, yes.
It's a legally binding agreement.
Right. Just kind of like how like 2-year-olds can testify in court on their own behalf. Yeah.
And so before we move on to the factory system, this is a little out of band, but I think it's very interesting and worth reading in full. I think it's from Montgomery, 1968. I didn't put a citation here, but anyway. So it says, an extreme case of immigrants providing an industry with its skilled labor was offered by the 1,000 or so carpet weavers in the country as in the early 1830s, at least 9/10 of whom were Scots, largely from Kilmarnock and Ayr. Or maybe it's Ayr, I don't know. So well did these mechanics know each other that when 63 of them struck the Thompsonville Carpet Manufacturing Company in Connecticut, they quickly assembled, compiled from memory a list of the 11 other principal carpet manufactories in the nation, wrote personal letters to friends in each of them explaining the dispute, notified the Blue Bonnet Tavern in New York City, which served as the country's hiring hall for carpet weavers, to divert men from the struck plant, and dispatched an appeal to the old countrymen in that city to warn off any Scots not reached by the other methods. So they basically got this extremely successful strike going by just talking to all their friends who were also carpet weavers.
Perfect.
Yeah. Okay, so we can move on to the factory systems. That's what our focus is on. So I'll just start with the Derby Silk Mill, which was the first successful silk mill in England, which was built at the behest of John and Thomas Laum. Laum received a patent for silk throwing technology, which was most likely the result of industrial espionage in Italy. So in 1715, John Laum got a job at an Italian silk throwing mill and broke into the shop at night to diagram the machinery. In 1718, he returned to England and got the patent for the technology. And interestingly, the patent says it's something like a method of silk throwing which has never before been seen in Great Britain. Not in the world, just in Great Britain.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Just nobody bothered to tell them about it.
Right.
Like, well, everybody knows that. I don't know why you have to explain it.
Right. So he got a patent for that technology, and then he had a mill built in Derby. And I could not figure out where he got the funds to actually do that, because prior to this, he was a journeyman mercer, which is a silk thrower.
Yeah, I know. I bet it was if he was just a journeyman with no quote unquote capital up till then, I wouldn't be surprised if he got a loan or even a gift from somebody simply because he was the motherfucker who stole the diagram or stole the idea, whatever. Because that's one of those examples in capitalism where you can sort of kind of self-make, is when you're like, oh, actually,
I also think the Crown is funding a lot of stuff.
Oh yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. Yeah, because they just wanted to shit stuff out and get as advanced as possible because they're an empire and it makes sense for them to do that. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So this is kind of mixed up. So William Hutton, who is a famous poet, I think, he worked at the Derby Silk Mill, and he described long hours, low wages, and common beatings, and that work continued as long as it was physically possible. So they basically only shut down for bad weather or mandated holidays or shit like that.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
But that's not slavery.
I think Hutton was working 12 hours a day or some shit like that.
Yeah. I mean, that sucks. Oh my God, that sucks.
So while I was researching this, one of our friends, Nathan, the French kid, came back to our group DM on Twitter.
And, how nice. Apologize for leaving us, obviously.
Yeah. Groveled for days.
Right.
We hazed the shit out of him for the second time. He's not doing too well now, but he'll recover eventually.
Right.
We made him batch off into the skull and everything. But he started talking about some research that his dad was doing, Pierre Gervais. which is very interesting. He studies accounting in like the 18th and 19th century,
Oh,
and
cool.
so he's looking at the account books of factories, and
Oh,
this is
depressing.
his current work. Apparently, until at least the 1830s, wage laborers were not typically employed. He said in factories, but I think what it actually is by factory owners.
Okay.
And so, on the other hand, like the machinery would be rented by the factory owners to independent producers. And so I saw some hints of this in other both other work by Pierre and other stuff that I read for this. And so I think what the arrangement was, the factory owner would rent the equipment to a factory foreman. The factory foreman would be an independent person who may also be hired by someone else who has the capital to hire, a foreman. And the foreman would hire all of the wage laborers who would then work the machines. And part of the reason I think this is because of William Hutton's description of working at the Derby Silk Mill, where obviously he was being paid wages if he's complaining about low wages. Unless he's talking about, I mean, I feel like if it weren't wage labor, he would describe like low piece rates or something like that, you know? And so I think that's what was happening was the chain went factory owner to independent foreman to hired wage labor. So I think that's pretty interesting. And let's see. Oh, the earliest. So that's the Derby Silk Mill. The earliest factory that we know of, at least in England, was a water mill in I think it's pronounced Lyme Regis. I don't know. It was found in a cadastral survey carried out by William the Conqueror in 1066.
Ah, yes, the big one.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
How they figured out how to parcel out all the new stolen land to all their favorite buddies.
Right. So. Okay. Sorry, this is a little disorganized, but so I don't know where I heard this, but this is fairly recent, and the reason that I wanted to do this episode, unfortunately, I was not able to find any good research on it because I just couldn't construct the right query.
Sure.
But I remember hearing or reading that factories actually preceded industrialization. So the narrative that we have of the Industrial Revolution was we used to work in workshops, and then some really smart guys figured out how to build machinery for the first time ever in history.
Oh, right, that narrative, yeah.
And
So
then
suddenly miraculously you just had to
common.
make factories. Right.
Right. Yeah,
Right.
and it's all because of economies of scale, because factories are just more efficient in reality.
Simply, yeah.
Yeah.
Which is arguable. Right. So.
Right. So apparently most manufacturing in the 18th century was actually done in rural areas using the putting out system.
Right.
The
Yeah.
working class in the cities worked mostly at ports because there was a huge amount of shipping going on from the colonies. And as artisans, because there were some goods that needed to be made in the cities where like nearby they were.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, based on this, I was starting to think that like if the fact that if it is true that factories preceded industrialization, factories probably served the purpose of employing large either recently unemployed or like newly employed workers with little training, such as the parish children.
Yeah. So the Highland clearances, classic case of fuckery that still has people pissed off to this very day. Basically, just to give you the Wikipedia real quick, the Highland clearances were the eviction of a significant number of tenants in the Scottish Highlands and Islands, mostly in the period 1750 to 1860. So about 100 and 110 years of basically forced migration, of workers, of people who were first tenants and peasants and shit, to become industrial workers or other kinds of workers, essentially displaced laborers. And I love the way this fucking sentence is constructed. In the first phase, clearance resulted from agricultural improvement, driven by the need for landlords to increase their income, which is just hilarious. Need for landlords to increase their income. Then in parentheses, they make the excuse, many landlords had crippling debts. You're like, well, fuck you.
What's interesting about that is I was reading I've been reading this book for like fucking 5 years, and I'm only like a third of the way through it or something. Okay. But in The Invention of Capitalism by Perelman, who's a Marxist, he describes the emerging bourgeois merchant class as getting the local lords and lairds of traditional England really into modern luxuries, and they would keep raising the price, and it basically started forcing them to take on debts, which of course they provided, and as a result, rents quadrupled in England and Scotland during that period.
Yep. Yeah,
and that's part of how they kind of destroyed the, the traditional land tenure system was by doing this whole thing. I'm sure that a lot of them sold their land off in order to pay off debts or
debts and stuff,
just to make a nice bundle of cash.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, so basically, this is actually something that Marx talks about, but I can't possibly summarize what he says about it, except that this is one of these huge, clear, stark examples of capitalist enclosure of land. And as it puts it in Wikipedia, this is that fucking capitalist double talk, double speak, where it says enclosure of the common lands and the fields, this fucking term, was a method of improvement. And of course, capital improvements is always just code for fucking people over who can't stop you, basically. So, but basically they took the land and they replaced mixed farming with large scale sheep farming so that they could get more wool, so they could make money off wool, and so forth. So this is actually how all this land became sheep land. Fuck you guys. Basically, these are all my ancestors' presents and shit. So, I have to fucking hate, and various other people who are part. I actually am a Pict. I'm part Pict, but you got me, motherfucker.
I'm actually 1/4 Pict.
Oh, cool. Well, I guess we're cool then.
Yeah. That means I can wear their traditional clothing and everything.
Hell yeah.
And do all their dances and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm an expert in the Pictish dances. You can't see me. I'm doing it right now. And I'm making mysterious...
I can hear you playing your traditional Pict drum.
Yes. So, this actually, the Highland clearances, in some ways, its role has been, I think, misunderstood and exaggerated for cultural reasons, but in other ways it cannot be overstated. It is a massive case of just capitalist, not just exploitation, but forced migration, essentially a kind of genocide, that through migration, and also by just forcing people who shouldn't have been forced off to go and not have this self-sustaining work that they had before, but to become to be forced into displaced labor arrangements, and instability and all this shit. And then a lot of them eventually went to North America. Anyway, so I'm sure that a lot of them were part of the masses of people who were then considered quote unquote unskilled. And of course, we've discussed what unskilled really means in, capitalist political economy. It just means they don't want to pay you very much because they fucking don't give a fuck about you. But so you've got Scots, you've got children, and you probably obviously you have women who are all considered these kind of unskilled, just kind of.
Well, I'm not sure if women exist.
Oh, well, okay. So theoretically, women, if they existed at this time,
there are only one gender.
Fair. Where was I? Oh yeah. So basically, I'm just kind of like speaking to this phase of industrialization that we were talking about. How which came first, the chicken or the egg? Which came first, the factory or the industrialization? And as you put it, it's likely that they had all these masses of people who they were like, oh, we can exploit these people really easily, so let's just put them all in one place and then put them on these machines and then work them to fucking death and not pay them very much. Not that it was unique to Scotland, but it was, it went everywhere, and we don't sort of see that now. But that was one big case. Anyway.
So next I want to go into a really interesting article I found called "The Organization of Work: The Emergence of the Factory Revisited," and it's by Rick Szostak in 1989, and it basically analyzes some different arguments about how the early factory system worked and why it emerged.
Mm-hmm.
According to the article, the development of the factory happened simultaneously with the development of supervised production. And he even argues that the primary advantage of the factory was actually the ability for labor to be supervised. So in the workshop system, you have a bunch of people in these different houses, usually just their house. So you can't have a foreman supervising all those people because they're all in different places. But if you're in a factory, you have a bunch of people in one building, and a foreman can easily, saunter around and yell at people and beat them with sticks and stuff.
Right. Yeah. Kind of like a plantation, but with a roof on it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So he raises a really interesting question, which is, why was the putting out system used for centuries and then suddenly abandoned in the 18th century? Factories, as I already pointed out, were not non-existent through history. There was one as early as 1066. Mm-hmm. So the traditional explanation is, we already touched on it, technology favored the factory, because some smart guy invented machines that we needed to put them in factories because, factories are more efficient and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
So, let's see. Oh yeah. So his evidence against this is, I think, very strong, which is that factories during the shift away from the putting out system actually used exactly the same technologies as workshops. So they were using the same machines.
Yeah, makes sense.
They were just in a centralized place. So England from around 1650 to 1750.
Sorry, I think I missed what you just said. You said they're just, and then did you pause?
Oh, I don't know what I was saying.
Okay, you said they were using largely the same equipment as workshops?
Yeah, they're using the same technologies. It was just that they were in a centralized location instead of different shops.
Right, gotcha. Okay. So essentially, centralization is a big feature of the factory system, right?
Yeah.
Not so much that the machinery itself is especially incredible, although that might be true. It might not be true, but it's centralization.
That happened later.
Really happening. Yeah. Okay.
So part of his theory here is that the evolution of transportation systems was basically the biggest contributor here. So from 1650 to 1750 in England, they massively expanded their network of roads and canals to both link industrial centers and network the smaller areas. So let's see, starting in the 13th and 14th century, there was a medieval practice called pavage, in which the king could issue letters patent granting a person or persons, like person or organization, the ability to collect tolls or to construct or maintain a road. So they were able to, say, I have a letter from the king saying I'm allowed to collect money from you for traveling along this road, and then they would theoretically use the money to maintain the road.
So it's like basically libertarian,
yes.
like libertarians invented something that existed for 800 years ago.
Yes.
They're like, what if we were
and there's actually
roads and we collected tolls? Like, okay.
Yeah. There were actually two other systems that I found. One was called pontage, I think, and the other was called moorage. And pontage was bridges and moorage was walls.
Oh, okay.
So
pontage and moorage,
during the Tudor period, which is from the 15th to the 17th centuries, road maintenance was mostly done by parish vestries, and a vestry is just the most local unit of government. The parish was like the local administrative division, and the vestry was the secular and religious government of the parish.
Okay.
So they took care of all the road maintenance, and they were very good at maintaining local roads, so like roads around the parish, but not highways that went through the parish to big cities. And so from around, I think it was like the very, very late 17th century, the English government started creating what was called turnpike trusts. And they were regional organizations that maintained roads and collected tolls on them to pay for it. So it was a lot like Pavage, but on a larger scale.
Okay.
So they were formed to fill the gap between the vestries, local roads, and the major highways. So they ended up creating, despite how hard it is to maintain roads in England because of how wet it is, they created like a world-class road system. They had like more miles of transportation than any country in the world at the time, even despite its size.
Holy shit!
Yeah,
that can't be that cannot be overlooked then in terms of like the ascendancy of British power, right? Like because if if you have really effective distributive networks, and less difficulty distributing, actively, then like you're going to do pretty well for yourself, and that's just true. That's true regardless of how centralized you are, right? That's true regardless of whether you're an exploitative power. That's just true for anybody.
War is all about logistics.
Exactly. So, that's really interesting. Didn't realize that.
So another factor here is that wagons became a lot more common in the 17th century. So before this, cargo was mostly transported on the backs of horses, and so with wagons, you could use the same amount of horses and carry way more shit because it was being put on wheels. Then. Yep.
Yeah. Nice.
Yeah. So
and people just got really into like jumping on the wagons. Like people of the same opinion would just jump on these wagons from town to town.
Yes.
Right.
That's where that classic phrase, jumping on the bandwagon came from.
Right. And this is actually how democracy was invented.
Yes.
Everyone needs to acknowledge that democracy consists of, just two different wagons at the opposite end of town, and people with different opinions go to each wagon, they jump onto it. If you don't agree with those two wagons, then, you don't belong in town. You just need to go to a different town. And then the wagons rush at each other.
With alcohol, you fall off the wagon.
Right. It's well-known fact. Now, how that ties in with democratic processes is still a mystery, but
it's a linguistic mystery.
Exactly, and then you have a party on the wagon. Okay.
I never know. I can never tell.
Yeah.
I would say I have one foot on the wagon right now, personally.
Yeah.
But I am hanging upside down from it, so it doesn't really help.
Yeah. Like not quite falling off. Yeah.
So basically, all this stuff meant that in England, transportation costs became very low because
Nice.
they were shipping the same amount of cargo for way less, took way less time. Like the journey from Manchester to London, which is like a good distance across the country. Currently, if you were to walk it on modern roads, it would take you 59 hours. In the 15th century or the 16th century, if you were to travel by horse from Manchester to London, it would take you 130 hours or so.
That's like a whole day.
Yeah. And then by 1650, I believe, the journey would only take about 60 hours. So they halved the time it would take to get across the country.
Nice, nice.
Um,
Man, 60
yeah.
hours to get across the country. That's not bad. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's pretty good.
Yeah,
Um,
you get across, you do a little picnic, you come back, home by dinner.
and they were actually like part of the Turnpike Trust thing was like people could kind of just like hop on a wagon, like you were saying, kind of jokingly, but like they're really good.
Gotcha. Got him.
Yeah.
Nice, nice.
So people could just like go around the country, which
Hmm.
I'm sure made it easier for unemployed workers to go to the city and work in a factory.
Right, right. So you see a bunch of dudes on a wagon. They're all looking chipper and happy, and you're like, oh, where are you going? Oh, I'm going down to London to get exploited. Oh, awesome. Let me join.
Let me jump on that bandwagon.
Yeah, yeah. Everyone's welcome.
That's called a
Uh,
callback, folks. Um, so yeah, so the transportation cost thing had a number of effects that made factories more advantageous. The cost of shipping food and maintaining inventories fell. Shipping food for obvious reasons, and maintaining inventories because the more quick and reliable your transportation is, the less of your inputs that you have to keep, and
right.
the faster you can get rid of the outputs that you produce.
Exactly. Exactly. Well,
So
this is a lead up. Like they didn't know it at the time, but I'm sure a lot of them had an inkling of what would eventually become in the 20th century just in time distribution.
that's
Uh,
exactly what I was about to say.
damn. Okay, go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead, man.
Okay, so just in time distribution um, is an innovation of, as I recall, it was something that the Japanese automakers came up with.
Toyota. Yep.
That's right. It was Toyota. That's right. They really knew how to work a factory floor because one of their interesting things that they did right, for better or worse, was they would allow they would have teams of specialists around, um, let's just call it like a station within the factory. So instead of just having like an assembly line per se, they would have like a bunch of different teams of guys working on the same station, and then so each team would learn to work together really effectively. So that was kind of cool. But then one of the things they would do is that they would reward you for if you're a specialist on any given team doing whatever the fuck you do as a specialist. If you have an idea for how work can be done better, then you can just come up to the fucking I don't know if it was the foreman or the like the plant manager or whatever, but you could come up to the up top and say, hey, I've been doing this for a while. I noticed that if we do this, this, and this, we could like save 3 steps, or we save this cost, or we could make it better, or even make a better product, right? So that was one of the things they did right. But another thing that they developed, and I think that it was because they were kind of in tune with their teams, right? And this is actually an argument. So it was kind of like I think it was kind of like they co-opted some of the ideas behind like syndicalism, but then they still made it a hierarchy. Right. But that kind of hybrid model was really effective. So eventually somebody on the floor or somebody in the mid range at like the foreman level figured out, hey, we don't even need to keep all this stock here all the time because that's expensive. You have to buy it all up front, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then it takes time to produce it anyway. When production is a flow, right? Production is a flow and sales are a flow, but this input stuff, we haven't converted that into just like a flow yet, per se. Like it flows to us and then it sits there and it can decay potentially. If it might get rusty, or it just goes to waste if we don't end up using it. So they figured out a way to essentially, I forget exactly how they did it, but they would anticipate orders, and then through this anticipation, they would then anticipate how much inventory they could get just to fulfill those orders, quote unquote, just in time. And so then they would order the inventory in such a way that the logistical, the supply chain coming up to them of the inputs they needed to manufacture would arrive to the plant just in time to be added as an input and turned into a finished product. So they didn't have to store all this shit all the time, like in the old days. If that makes any sense, I'm not sure if it was a bit of an ass back.
Yeah, it's actually called the economic order quantity. It's part of queuing theory. I think we should just do a whole episode on the Toyota manufacturing system because we could easily get into
Toyota
everything. They really revolutionized manufacturing. Yeah. Like it's crazy.
Yeah, they really did. Yeah. So then grocery stores in the States started to use the Toyota just in time, but for like food and stuff. So that's actually an interesting adaptation. But go ahead. Yeah.
It's basically used everywhere now, I think.
Yeah.
Any large business anyway.
Yeah, from what I remember from my coursework, it was Toyota did this for autos, then American Groceries adapted it and picked it up, and then from there everybody was like, "Oh, this is really fucking effective. You can do it for, complex manufactured products like cars, and you can do it for like simple commodities like like essentially
vacuums.
Almost primary exactly like so then they're just like everybody fucking do this all the time." Which is one reason why it's one way in which I think shipping has changed, but also like shipping has always been important, but it's sort of funny that like container shipping, we did that episode on that. Like container shipping is now like massive industry or massive business, I should say, whatever. And so you've got these massive containers of shit going every which way all the time. But it's not to like fill a warehouse with inputs per se. It's to get things to people just in time, and yet you still need extreme volume. So it's like I don't know if it's kind of a wash at that point when it comes to distribution. But what it does mean is that the massive shipping and distribution flows that are now out there and that are necessary for just-in-time production to work, those distribution channels and the rate of travel and everything become that much more important and therefore that much more expensive when they fail or break down or are delayed, right? Because then manufacturing just can't happen. And so it's a time and cost saver when you can make just-in-time work, but when there's some kind of distributional problem, they're just fucked. So that's just something to keep in mind, listeners. Just something to keep in mind.
So workers started to specialize further, performing smaller tasks repeatedly. Szostak says this would drive up the cost of transportation for workshops as semi-finished parts move between shops and cottages. But I don't see any reason to think that the increased specialization caused the shift to the factory as opposed to like being the result of it. He doesn't really even ask that question, let alone like provide any evidence to support it.
I just don't see that there's probably much of a like necessary relationship anyway between specialization and the factory. Like the factory is centralized, but if you want to talk about a need for specialization, you talk about like workshops and stuff, and so
I mean, I guess his thing,
right? Like the factory is where mass labor happens.
You would be doing an assembly line production,
right. But that's the funny thing, right? Is that this is where that kind of unskilled, terminology comes in. Is that you look at an assembly line, and the whole idea is sure, it's a specialization of a kind, I guess, but it's very like rudimentary specialization in many cases. It's check. Well, so in my case, I worked at a fucking factory. It was my first paid job, and I was there for almost a month, and it sucked. But I was a TIG welder, and I would weld 7 bushings at a time, which are the oil injectors for pistons in a car engine, and I would have to use a TIG welding gun, which is tungsten and gas. So it'd be this sharp tungsten rod that was like gripped by a thing, and you'd like have a foot pedal that would send charge to the tungsten, like a high amount of charge that would heat it up, just like in a light bulb, like a conventional light bulb, right? And the sharp point of the tungsten rod would then essentially become extremely hot. And then if you touched it to something like steel, then it would spark and weld it, right? So I would weld, right? So I'd weld this nut to this pipette right at the join where there was like a hole in the nut, like on the side. And I would do that 7 at a time, and the goal was to get like 2,000 or 3,000 of these done a day. Okay, fun.
Usually you nut in a hole.
Yeah, with my pipette. 7 at a time. But yeah, so
that's a really cute name.
Pipette.
Makes it seem very dainty.
Yes, Pipette is actually my favorite character in Les Mis. But anyway, yeah. So I was a specialist, right? It's kind of the point of me saying all this, besides making a jerk off joke. But like, so I was a specialist in TIG welding. That was the entry level job at this factory before they let you do anything else, and you have to pretty much prove yourself because it's just this monotonous bullshit. And yes, there is a knack to it, and yes, you should be paid a fair wage for it. But beyond a certain point, as long as your hands aren't constantly shaking and your eyes aren't fucked up, almost anybody could probably figure out how to do this. If there's a knack to it, and then once you get that knack down, then the primary concerns for you are staying sane and focused for 8 hours at a time, and just not fucking up more than a few per day, and that's pretty much it.
Yeah.
So yes, I was a specialist, but I wasn't a specialist the way that say a
nuclear engineer.
Alzheimer's, right? Or yeah, exactly. Like an Alzheimer's doctor or a nuclear engineer is a specialist, right? So it's really interesting that this term is used in econ to say any number of these things, right? Any range of quote unquote specialization.
Yeah, I mean it's really just hyper specialization, right? Because a specific type of doctor still has a whole range of skills.
Exactly.
But
exactly.
If you're working
on
a
large scale,
hyper specialized assembly line job, you're only expected to have a single skill.
Yeah, yeah. And this is where that kind of reasoning comes in, that capitalism, industrial capitalism, as we know it, makes an effort to turn people into machines, to kind of make them useless, right? Which again is kind of a Marx thing, but it's anybody can fucking understand that, right? It makes you less and less useful to the system, even though you're necessary to the running of the system, because it de-skills you in so many ways, and so forth and so on. And what's fucking depressing about
I was going to say that de-skill is actually kind of I don't know. I mean, I guess it's kind of true, but it also kind of buys into the unskilled labor language,
Right. Yeah.
I kind of think hyper specialization is probably a better term.
Well, let's put it this way, and I agree. De-skilling to me in this context, much of it means to me, you take these people. So, for example, the Highland clearances, right? You've got these people who are tenant homesteader types, forcibly resettled, right?
Yeah,
they have this massive range of skills and know-how and rich kind of cultural history and context and economic, industrial and agricultural history and context, and all these things that they are able to do now. Maybe they don't do all of these things at expert levels. Maybe they don't do all of these things as well as any other person can, but they do it well enough to survive and live and subsist. Then they're taken off that land. They are forced off. They're put into this situation where there's like 300 of them in a fucking, unventilated, brutality building, and, working 12 to 16 hours a fucking day, and getting fucking abused, and the women are getting fucking molested and raped, and the kids probably are too, by and large, and all this full fucking shit, and they're not getting paid very much, right? And then, of course, the rent's high because they don't own their own fucking home anymore. And in this case, de-skilling really is that they have skills that are useful, and they have capabilities and capacities that are useful to themselves, that are their right to be able to use, but they're being deprived of the opportunity, and their rights are being trampled, to do those things. And so then they're reduced in their role and in their capacities, essentially by somewhere between coercion and entrapment, to not exercise the skills which are good for them, but to exercise a very limited array of skills, very simple skills that are good for the people who run the factory and own it. And to me, that's really what de-skilling ought to mean.
It's interesting you use the Highlanders as an example, because another thing that I read in The Invention of Capitalism was that like a Scotsman, like a traditional Scotsman, could make a pair of shoes called brogues in about 2 hours. But if they were to do wage labor for them, it would take them like days to be able to afford a pair of shoes, which were even lower quality than the brogues were.
Yep, exactly. And this is the insane thing about like capitalist industrial practices. Is I was thinking about this the other day, and also for most of my life. But like you think about things like shoes, shirts, furniture, right? All these things that are craft commodities, that are finished goods that traditionally would be made by to borrow the structure and the term that we were talking about earlier, the master or the journeyman, journey person,
or your wife,
right. Like woven goods, textiles, stuff like that. All these things that the factories essentially took over and took away from people's ability to make for themselves and for each other. They are largely produced in less quality, and the cheapness of these goods is actually kind of a myth, like, because we don't make that much money, right? So, you can, if you want really cheap shit, you can get really cheap shit, but it's basically commensurate with the shit wage you're making. So it all kind of is a wash. And then if you want good shit, well, you have to make good money. And to make good money, you have to be an exploiter or like a lucky specialist of some kind that is important to the military industrial complex, and yada, 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 And so, it's like we live in like a cheapened economy. We live in a cheapened material culture, and not just.
Yeah, I think clothes are a great example, because all the clothes that we buy now are just like pieces of garbage that
it falls apart
for a season.
Yeah.
Especially for women's clothes.
Oh yeah, exactly.
It's crazy how often women have to buy clothes.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the interesting things, since we're on that topic, like the cost difference between men's kind of boring clothing, by and large boring clothing, but which is often made with like slightly higher quality. So it's like sturdier but also shittier looking. And then women's clothing, which is like very heavily trained to the like what do they call that, like the micro seasons and shit
Yeah.
in fashion, so that like, oh, you always have to look good because we've sexually commodified you, and we expect you to always be pretty in whatever way some dipshit in fucking New York decides you have to be, right? And then you have to make those decisions, and you have to, put up the costs for like cosmetics and clothing and all this shit, and constantly be shifting and dancing through this shit. And then, but then the expectation in like the kind of heteropatriarchy is that like, well, if you're a rich man, you'll just get something that like is tailor made, and you're just like, you look good all the time, and it's like high quality, and fuck you. And if you're not a rich man, fuck you automatically, so it's,
but even then, like I have clothing that is like 12 years old that only recently, like I have pairs of jeans from when I was 18 that only recently like got rips in both knees. Like some of them had rips in one knee, but now like all of them have rips in both knees, and like the the cuff on the bottom is like shredded and shit like that. But like I've had those jeans for 12 fucking years, and I only stopped wearing them like, maybe a year ago.
No, and let me like adjust my sort of tone here. I don't mean that like men have it worse than women. That is obviously not true. I think we all know that. But just like,
I thought you were saying that men have it better than women. I thought that was your whole point.
Okay. That's clear. Yeah, men's clothing is often typically much sturdier, and so forth. Also, like the lower expectations that are placed on us to be dressed in any particular, stylishness, whatever.
I also think the decline of lifespan has been very rapid as well. Like, if you had clothing that you bought in like the year 2000, it would probably last a lot longer than if you bought some clothing now.
Yeah. I think between the sort of just the general cheapening of clothing and all that, and also like the shift toward like I think the term is
thinner fabrics.
Thinner fabrics and all this shit, and then also
stitches.
Yeah, I mean, like, and because like if they can cut costs on their side, for the inputs in manufacturing, but then still charge you as much or more, that's just one that's one way that you increase your differential power, right? In manufacturing.
Plus, like, if they can shave a penny off of the cost of a pair of jeans, and they make 1 million pairs of jeans every year, that's like $100,000 they save, something like that.
That's a bonus,
Yeah,
or part of a bonus.
Plus, not only that, but if the jeans become cheaper and you keep buying them, which you will because you don't have another source for them,
right? Exactly.
Additionally, they make even more money because then you have to buy them more often, so they get more revenue and lower costs as well. So it's a win-win for them to make things cheaper to the point that like you won't complain about it,
Yeah, exactly. It's
Anyway, we're getting off track.
Textiles, So textiles were also a whole other fucking set of topics. So
so back to the hyper specialization division of labor thing. So I think what may have actually caused the increased division of labor was the reduced cost of imported materials. So according to Szostak, from the 17th to 18th century, like manufacturers started using like way more specialized materials and more materials in general. So like he uses an example of buckle makers. They went from using just iron and tin in the 17th century to including copper, zinc, brass, glass, jewels, and imitation gold and silver by the 18th century. And then like potters began to use clays from around the country instead of just whatever was there. And they would decorate them with imported bone ash and flint. So I think that like the fact that there were more materials being used because it was cheaper meant that people could be just specialized in like putting a glass jewel on a buckle instead of like making the whole thing. Because people didn't already have the skills to do that necessarily. So, it would be easier to push them into a more specialized job where they were just doing the one thing.
Right. Right. Yeah. Like, and again, specialization is in a narrower role, like a narrowing as opposed to like a deepening. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.